The heavy old UAZ, nicknamed Bukanka by drivers for its shape and indomitable but slow power, struggled along a long-forgotten taiga road that could hardly be called a forest path.
The trunks of the fir trees scraped against the iron sides like long fingers warning of interference, and the hum of the engines seemed only to emphasize the absolute, unwelcoming silence of the Cyan taiga. Ivan Andreevich Bielov, 48 years old, nicknamed Raven, sat in the front seat, shoulder to shoulder with police captain Arkady Semyonovich, a man whose face was already covered with sweat and anxiety, even though the sun had only just risen. Above the treetops, Gorin did not look at the officer. His heavy, unblinking gaze, which had earned him his nickname, was fixed on the movement of the branches, on the way the light refracted through the coniferous thicket, on every bend in the land. His world, which city law had always tried to tarnish, but could never understand. Arkady Semyonovich finally broke the silence, his voice a half-tone higher than it should have been. Ivan Andreevich, you understand. The regional leadership is putting pressure on us. 3 in a week. Morale, bar. This is no longer just poaching. It's something wild. We just don't see any traces, you understand? 5 people went there, including the experienced gamekeeper Spiridonov, and nothing. 0 clues. They just say that the animals fell asleep and died. Nonsense. Gorin did not answer, only slightly moving his stiff, sunburnt eyebrow. He had not worked for the state for a long time. He had been dismissed from his position as senior state inspector with scandal for abuse of authority. He had been too zealous in protecting the forest from too influential people. Now he was a freelance consultant, and his involvement in cases was a humiliation for the police, which they could only swallow in their utter helplessness. For them, he was a last resort when the criminal's trail disappeared from the asphalt into the mud and stone, his true element. The UAZ stopped at an old dilapidated cordon. Raven got out of the car first, followed like a shadow by his West Siberian Laika, Shadow. She had the same attentive but non-judgmental gaze. The dog seemed to understand human weakness better than humans themselves. Ivan slowly inhaled, taking in the smells of damp earth, moss, pine needles, and something foreign and unhealthy. His philosophy was simple. The taiga was a living organism, and any disturbance of its balance felt like a disease. And now this organism was sick. 2 young detectives, clearly irritated and frozen, stood at the edge of the cordon, clumsily imitating severity. Raven ignored them, ordering Arkady Semyonovich to stay where only his dog had set foot. Unlike the crime scene tape, he knew what true inviolability of a crime scene meant. The shadow moved forward silently, its sense of smell being Ivan's main tool. The place where the carcasses lay was eerily quiet, unusually quiet. A typical murder in the taiga involves noise, commotion, broken branches, blood stains, and hastily buried shell casings. Here, however, there was perfect, dead silence. 3 carcasses, 2 of which belonged to marals and 1 to a snow leopard, were neatly stacked on clean moss away from the clearing. The animals had been bled dry, and the trophies, the horns, the leopard skin, had been removed with surgical, professional precision. But that wasn't what struck Gorin. What shocked him was what surrounded these dead bodies. He dropped to his knees. His face, carved with wrinkles like riverbeds, moved closer to the ground. It was land he knew like the back of his hand, a book he could read in complete darkness. But someone had replaced the pages of this book. Around the bodies, on the soft covering of moss and last year's pine needles, there were footprints,
perfect ones. Footprints of marl antlers, footprints of leopard paws, every curve, every groove on the paw pad, every small pebble crushed by a hoof was in its place. It was as if the animals in question had come over themselves, lay down neatly, and breathed their last. There were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, and, most importantly, no human footprints. The criminal was invisible, a ghost whose movements were camouflaged by the natural surroundings. Spiridonov said it could have been some kind of predator that killed the other animals. It killed them, then dragged them here. But why would a predator leave its prey? Ivan Andreevich, whispered Arkady Semyonovich, keeping a respectful distance, his voice trembling. The raven did not deign to answer him. He knew it was not an animal. Nature is never perfect. Beasts always have flaws, slight asymmetries, accidents caused by fatigue, hunger, or instinct. There was no life in these prints, which perfectly recreated the shape. They were dead, mechanical copies. It was a challenge thrown down to him personally, the only person who could notice this involuntary falsehood. He lifted the edge of the moss where the criminal's footprint should have been. The moss and lichen were in place, but Raven caught the slightest, barely discernible clue. The mossy prints were not just perfect, they were unnaturally perfect. It was like looking at a fake painting. All the brushstrokes were there, but the artist's soul was missing. Beneath the perfect copy of a hoof, he noticed a microscopic, almost invisible distortion in the soil structure. It was not a print, but pressure, distributed too evenly, too deliberately. It was a trace left, not by the weight of a body, but by a tool. Whoever did this knew how to circumvent the laws of physics, how to make the tiger lie. The raven rose. He was calm, but inside, beneath his stony facade, something cold and sharp awakened. He felt the tension that had built up over years of disappointment in the system find an outlet. This was not just a poacher. This was a master. He approached the carcass of the snow leopard, whose skin was of incredible, almost mystical value to collectors, and ran his hand over it. His fingers, roughened by work, feeling its velvety smoothness. Not for meat, not for sustenance. This murder was committed for the sake of superiority and mockery. He took 10 steps back, away from the police, and began to slowly, methodically examine the area. Not distracted by the obvious, his eyes, Raven's eyes, were not looking for a trail, but for the absence of a trail where it should be, or, conversely, a sign of an unnatural presence where it was not expected. The shadow, which until that moment had been alert and confused, suddenly froze, its nose twitching. The dog, although unable to pick up the false trail, sensed something else, something so alien that it did not fit into its picture of the world. Ivan Andreevich bent down again, now away from the bodies, and his fingers touched a thin strip of moss growing on an old, fallen cedar tree. The strip was flattened, not erased, not torn, but flattened, as if something had been placed on it and then carefully removed, restoring its shape. But the weight that had flattened this moss was, according to Ivan's calculations, disproportionate to the weight of a human being. It was a light, sliding imprint. The raven suddenly realized The criminal was carrying more than just himself. He was carrying a load. And to prevent this load from leaving a trace, he used a sophisticated, almost unimaginable device to mask the load. It wasn't just knowledge of the taiga. It was knowledge of Ivan Belov's methods, knowledge of how he searches, how he thinks, and how he can be tricked using his own rules. Gorin suddenly felt a sharp, chilling certainty that was worse than fear. It was a duel, stretched out over time, and it was being led by the one who once sat with him by the fire, listening to every word about how to read even the wind. It could only be Igorov, the talented and ambitious former gamekeeper whom Gorin himself had expelled from the reserve 10 years ago for attempting to cross a moral line. Igorov, who had always wanted to prove that his technique could be more perfect than his teacher's. Ivan Andreevich slowly rose, his gaze becoming even heavier and more distant. He no longer saw the usual crime scene in front of him. He saw a challenge, encrypted in a mossy trail, and his heart, long accustomed to loneliness and tranquility, began to beat with dry, hard determination. He would have to go deeper than the laws of nature, to a place where it was not instinct that ruled, but a cold, calculating mind. The justice he valued above the law had been violated, not simply by murder, but by a sacrilegious deception of his native taiga. And this deception demanded atonement. He signaled to Arkady Semyonovich, who, seeing this grim determination, instinctively understood that something unimaginable was about to begin. Gorin nodded, indicating that the investigation had begun for him. He already saw ahead of him not just tracks, but a signature, the signature of a master who had emerged from his own shadow. Without saying a word, Gorin pushed off from the ground, leaving the bewildered police officers behind. Arkady Semyonovich did not dare to object when Ivan Andreevich pointedly waved his hand toward the plastic bags and photographic equipment that the young operatives had brought with them. For the Raven, these city toys were not just useless, they were offensive because they imposed a language on nature that was completely alien to it. The taiga did not speak the language of numbers. It spoke the language of shades of moss, wind direction, and soil elasticity. And this language could not be recorded on tape or recorded in a protocol. His method, perfected over 40 years of survival and tracking experience, began where any laboratory was powerless. He began to listen to the place. He moved away from the bodies of the morels and the leopard, as if they were merely props in a more important drama, and began to move slowly around the perimeter, perceiving the slightest changes in the space not so much with his eyes as with his entire body. The shadow moved alongside him, its slow, focused silhouette inseparable from its master's movements. The smell of blood was distinct but strangely limited. It was not splattered, it was collected, as if subject to some will. The Raven began to reconstruct the chronology of events, like an old watchmaker assembling a complex mechanism. 3 animals had been killed at different times. The marel, with the largest antlers, judging by the degree of rigor mortis and the faint oxidation of blood on its skin, was the first to be killed, about 3 days ago. The leopard was the second, a day ago, and the second morel was the last, no more than 12 hours ago. This was not a spontaneous hunt, but a systematic preparation. But how did they end up here? Neatly stacked, without any traces of dragging, without a single broken twig that would reveal the killer's path. Ivan Andreevich returned to the place where he had found the abnormally flattened moss. He pulled his constant companion from his belt, an old hunting knife with a wide, well-used blade. The knife was not used for digging. It was used as an extension of his fingers, as a tool to determine soil density and temperature.
Slowly, almost ritually, he plunged the tip of the blade into the ground next to the perfect hoofprint. The pressure of the knife, its reaction to the resistance of the soil, gave him information that his eyes could not provide. Usually, when an animal or a person steps on the ground, the pressure is distributed unevenly. The center of the footprint is deeper, the edges are looser, and there is a slight shift in the soil. Here, however, he felt that the pressure was perfectly even, as if it were not a living weight, but a hydraulic press. This was the main clue. The criminal did not simply cover his tracks, he replaced them. Using some kind of tool, perhaps a mold that was pressed into the ground to create the illusion of an animal's footprint. But even that didn't explain where the footprints of the person who pressed the mold had gone, or the footprints of his steps with the load. Raven dismissed the idea of a mold. Too much movement. Too many chances for error. He began to look not for a print, but for a rhythm. He began to move slowly in the direction from which, according to his calculations, the criminal must have come. His eyes scanned the ground, ignoring the obvious hoofprints, which he knew were false. He was looking for only one thing: a barely noticeable, unnatural step. An ordinary person, even one who professionally masks their tracks, inevitably makes mistakes caused by anatomy. A step shorter or longer. One leg slightly stronger than the other. Fatigue, causing the toe to rake a little. But here, there was none of that. The rhythm of movement was too even, too calculated. And suddenly, at the foot of an old pine tree, he saw it. It wasn't a footprint. It was a distortion. In the place where, according to the logic of the animal's movement, there should have been a hoofprint, he found that the finest fibers of the pine root, which are usually flattened, were, on the contrary, slightly raised by a fraction of a millimeter, as if something had pressed on them from below and quickly removed them. It was not an imprint, but the effect of absence. Too smooth. Too perfect. Too familiar. The raven straightened up. His breathing, which he always controlled, became slightly deeper, but remained slow and low. He recognized this signature. This was not just a poacher. This was a man who had mastered the art of camouflaging tracks against the natural background to such an extent that the track ceased to be a track and became part of the landscape. It was the very technique he himself had developed and taught. A technique that taught that to become invisible, you must not hide, but imitate chaos. You must make the tracker's eye see what it expects to see and not notice what is too smooth, too logical. Ivan Andreevich closed his eyes. With his inner vision, he saw not the forest, but the auditorium of the old hunting school, himself as a young instructor with burning eyes, and a group of cadets. And among them was Egorov. Sergei Egorov, a guy with incredible natural intuition, but with a dangerous thirst for self-affirmation. He was the only one who not only mastered the technique, but also began to develop it, offering solutions that even Voron considered dangerous, bordering on cynicism. Why hide your tracks, Ivan Andreevich, when you can create someone else's? The perfect stranger. No one will look for a person where they see a leopard. Ivan then bitterly dismissed the idea, calling it blasphemy and contempt for nature. Now that idea had taken material form. He lowered his hand, and Shadow instantly moved closer, pressing herself against his leg. The dog, not understanding what was going on,
sensed her master's growing tension. It wasn't a scent she could pick up. It was a thought that Raven had just caught, and that thought was hostile. "He knows my method thoroughly, Shadow. Thoroughly." Raven whispered in a low, hoarse voice. "He uses my own knowledge of the forest to create a lie that I must see."
This is not a hunt.
It is a duel between two masters. The realization weighed on him like a stone. If Igorov used this technique, he must have developed it to an unimaginable degree. Not just imitation of a step, but imitation of weight transfer. A maral weighs nearly 300 kilograms. A leopard weighs less than 100. To carry such a load through the taiga, and in such a way that there was not a single drag mark left, not a single crushed branch at waist or shoulder level, where he would have carried the bodies, required almost a technical miracle, or devilish patience, brought to the point of obsession. The Raven felt his disappointment in the city laws fade into the background, giving way to pure, wild excitement. It was a struggle for natural justice, his personal code of honor. Egorov didn't just kill animals. He committed the most terrible crime for Ivan Andreevich. He disrupted the natural order of things, forcing the tiger itself to lie. He used the knowledge that had been passed on to him to abuse the place that had raised him. Ivan Andreevich slowly walked away from the cordon, moving like a shadow along an invisible route. He wasn't looking for tracks. He was looking for logic. If the killings took place in different locations, then the criminal must have had some kind of central point where he took his trophies for professional processing, bleeding and skinning. And the route he used to transport the bodies 3 times had to be carefully concealed. Voron began to mentally map all the camouflage techniques he knew and taught onto the reserve's map, looking for one that Yegorov could have developed. Camouflaging weight, camouflaging smell, camouflaging time. Igorov had to move not in a straight line, but along a complex, winding trajectory, making maximum use of natural trace extinguishers, streams, stone scree, areas of old hard moss that does not retain footprints. But even where nature erases traces, a sense of someone else's presence remains. And that sense was directed toward the old geological exploration sites deep into the ridge. Ivan Andreevich stopped at a stream whose waters flowed, washing away the pebbles. Here, the perfect paw prints of the snow leopard ended, breaking off at the water's edge. Another tracker would have decided that the animal had gone into the water, but Voron knew that a snow leopard would not walk in water unnecessarily. And a person who knows that water erases tracks will definitely take advantage of this. He crouched down and carefully examined the bank on the opposite side. Nothing. Perfect, untouched nature. But on the highest rock, which was too sharp for a person wearing normal shoes to step on, he noticed a microscopic chip. Fresh, the cut of which had barely had time to darken. Too high for an animal. He carried the load across the stream, Voron said hoarsely, turning to Tenny. And to hide the traces of his own jump from the bank, he used something for support, which he then removed. Or else he jumped with superhuman precision, but the load must have left its mark. Raven realized that Igorov wasn't just covering up the tracks, he was erasing them, using technical means that a simple poacher wouldn't think of. The duel shifted from primitive tracking to psychology and technology that went beyond the laws of the forest. The tension grew. Ivan Andreevich felt a part of himself that he had long buried awakening. His obsession with the truth. His willingness to follow a trail even where it became invisible. He had to catch the man who thought he could deceive the taiga and therefore his teacher. He had to show that even the absence of a trail was the most obvious trail. Voron turned away from the stream where the false trail of the leopard had ended and moved back toward the police. He no longer needed to examine the crime scene further, because the tiger had told him everything he needed to know. The criminal was not just a poacher, but an intellectual killer who knew his own language perfectly. Arkady Semyonovich, seeing the expression on Ivan Andreevich's face, devoid of any emotion but filled with cold, stubborn determination, instinctively understood that the external fuss with the protocols was over, and the real, invisible work had begun. Voron approached the captain and stopped so close that the officer felt the heavy breath of the Laika, the shadow, on him. "I need the reserve's archives," said Raven in a low, hoarse voice, each word of which seemed to have physical weight. "All the personal files of inspectors and gamekeepers for the last 10 years. And a list of everyone who has taken my tracking courses." "Immediately." Arkady Semyonovich wanted to object, that this was beyond his authority, that permission was required. But when he met that incredibly attentive, predatory gaze, he swallowed his words. Raven wasn't asking. He was ordering. The police in his world were only an auxiliary tool, and Semyonovich realized that at that moment he was not on official business, but on Raven's territory, where laws were written not in offices, but in the balance of nature. 2 hours later, after a nervous drive and an even more nervous phone call between the captain and the regional center, the Raven found himself in a small, half-forgotten administration building of the old Cyan Reserve, where he himself had once worked. Silence reigned here, saturated with the smell of dust, old papers, and bygone times. The archives were kept in a narrow, cold room where the paper had yellowed from humidity and neglect. Here Ivan Andreevich met Nikolai Petrovich, his former boss. Nikolai Petrovich, a man worn out and tired, with dull but still kind eyes, was the very reason why Voron had been fired 10 years ago, even though Petrovich himself had tried his best to protect him. At that time, Voron had crossed the line, standing too zealously in the way of an influential official, which turned into his personal disaster. "You didn't come here on business, Vanya," Nikolai Petrovich said, his voice quiet, full of bitterness and regret as he dusted off the folder. "You came for an answer." Ivan Andreevich did not deny it. He just nodded silently. Their relationship was complicated, mixed with respect and unresolved conflict. Petrovich respected Voron as the best inspector and tracker, but condemned him for his uncompromising nature, which had cost him his job. Voron despised Petrovich for his weakness in the face of the system, but understood him as a man who was trying to preserve the reserve, even at the cost of compromise. Finally, among the pile of old documents, they found the folders they needed. Ignoring the official forms, Ivan Andreevich immediately turned to the list of students who had taken his informal, in-depth courses on the art of reading tracks. These were special classes where he shared unspoken rules and philosophy. His gaze caught on one name: Sergei Igorov. Igorov, 28 years old, young, talented, but dismissed shortly after Voron's departure for unauthorized behavior and excessive risk-taking. It was Igorov. The closed folder took Voron back to the past for a moment, to a time when the sun seemed brighter and his belief in natural justice was unshakable. 10 years ago. Igorov was the best of his students, not just talented, but obsessed. He grasped not the technique, but the essence of the method, that the forest is not just trees, but an open book, and every trace on the ground is a word. Igorov didn't just want to read this book. He wanted to edit it. Ivan Andreevich remembered that night by the campfire at the training camp. The passionate, ambitious Igorov, then just a boy, sat opposite him. The flames reflected in his eyes. He argued with Vorong about the perfection of camouflage. You teach us to erase our tracks, Ivan Andreevich, to hide them against the natural background, Yegorov said then with respectful defiance. But isn't that primitive? Isn't the highest skill not to hide the tracks, but to replace them? Not to leave a void, but to create a lie. To leave the perfect paw print of a wolf, so that a tracker who knows how a wolf thinks will go down the wrong path, confident in his own righteousness. The highest victory is to make your enemy believe the lie that he himself would have created. The raven then harshly rejected this idea, calling it cynicism and a betrayal of the taiga's trust. The forest trusts you when you walk through it honestly, replied Ivan Andreevich, his voice as firm as a Siberian rock. You read it, and it allows you to read it. As soon as you start deceiving it, you become a sick individual who disrupts the balance, and the forest itself will remove you. This is not about technique, Igorov. It's about philosophy. Igorov then lowered his gaze, but a shadow of resentment and stubbornness flashed in his eyes. He did not accept the lesson. He accepted the challenge. Now, holding the yellowed folder in his hands, Voron understood. All these years, Igorov had not forgotten his words. He did not simply become a poacher for money, although that was certainly part of it. He became an artist killer, who used the art taught by his teacher to prove himself right. The mossy footprint was a perfect animal print, created with tools and technology to make Ivan Andreevich Belov doubt his method and his philosophy. It was not just a crime. It was a personal duel that Yegorov had been preparing for 10 years. He did not just want to leave his teacher. He wanted to surpass him, forcing him to admit that deception and cynicism can be more effective than respect and truth. Nikolai Petrovich, who was watching Voron, asked, "You know him, don't you?" "Is that Igorov?" Voron slowly closed the folder. His eyes, once again completely calm and unreadable, looked through the wall, as if he could already see his opponent deep in the taiga. "I created him, Nikolai Petrovich," replied Ivan Andreevich, and his voice sounded not with condemnation, but with deep, quiet sadness. "And now he has grown up, and is trying to prove that his creation is more perfect than the original plan. This is not about trophies. This is a challenge. The outcome of this case does not depend on who runs faster or shoots better. It depends on who thinks beyond the laws of nature." He crossed a line that I forbade him to cross. He has become a sick individual. At that moment, through the dusty window of the archive, Raven saw the shadow lying by the door raise its head and whimper quietly, but insistently, the hair on its neck rising slightly. The dog sensed the same hostile thought that had just been born in its master's mind. Igorov was no longer just a name from the past. He was an obsession that disrupted the balance not only in the taiga, but also in Raven's own soul. Without saying another word, Ivan Andreevich took the folder with Igorov's personal file, which he would now never give to anyone, and left the stuffy archive to return to his world, where truth and lies were written on the ground, and where one man had to defeat the shadow of his past in order to restore order. He returned to the place that had already been cleared of evidence by city specialists, leaving behind only strips of forensic tape, which became for Voron another symbol of futile efforts and misunderstanding. In his hands now was not just information about the crime, but the personal file of Sergei Igorov, a ghost who, as it turned out, was flesh and blood from his own past. His certainty about the identity of the criminal did not bring relief. On the contrary, it sharpened his perception, turning the investigation into a duel where his opponent knew all his trump cards. Now, Ivan Andreevich was not looking for who had committed the murder. He was looking for how Igorov thought, creating his perfect lie. The raven moved away from the clearing to where the moss was thickest and most elastic, the best surface for leaving a trace, but also the best for studying it. He crouched down again, his fingers, sinewy and strong like roots, touching the cold ground. This time, he wasn't just looking for distortions. He was looking for the mechanics of deception. He noticed that the mossy footprint, the imprint of a snow leopard's paw, was not only perfect in shape, but also perfect in structure. A real predator's paw, even with the most careful step, always shifts the loose soil slightly, pushing air out of the porous moss and leaving a microscopic but vivid deformation. Igorov's footprint was sterile. The moss was flattened but not displaced. Its fibers were not torn, and the air was not completely displaced. This indicated that the pressure was applied slowly and evenly, without the dynamics of a living step. It was a stamp, not a footprint. Ivan Andreevich realized that Igorov had not simply used a mold. He had probably used some kind of stabilizing device, or even a special movement technique that allowed him to press the mold to the ground and then lift it strictly vertically, eliminating any lateral displacement. It was not just camouflage. It was the creation of an anti-trace, a phenomenon that Voron himself, in his youth, considered only a theoretical hypothesis, impossible in field conditions. Yegorov proved the opposite, and he did so to humiliate his teacher, to show that theory could become a cynical, deadly practice. Yegorov's sophistication lay not in hiding his path, but in directing the tracker's attention in the wrong direction. Ivan Andreevich remembered how he himself had almost fallen for this trick in the first chapter, when his eyes, accustomed to looking for poachers' tracks, saw the perfect animal prints and stopped. This was the psychology of deception. He knew that a professional like Voron or any experienced gamekeeper would instantly notice the perfect tracks of a rare animal and automatically begin to construct a chronology of events based on what was expected. All his instincts, all his years of experience, demanded that he read the animal, not the man. Igorov had created a cognitive trap using his knowledge of how a tracker's brain works. He made them see what they wanted to see. And that was the most subtle and malicious application of his method. Shadow, his faithful West Siberian Laika, sat nearby, her ears alert, but her body tense. Raven noticed that the dog was nervous. She could smell the blood of dead animals. She could smell the police. But the absence of the criminal scent in such a large load that he had carried confused her. Usually, human sweat, adrenaline, the smell of skin and fabric inevitably leave a microscopic but distinct aromatic trail, especially when carrying heavy carcasses. Here, however, There was an aromatic void. Shadow couldn't pick up the trail, not because it was poorly hidden, but because it had been neutralized. Ivan Andreevich ran his hand over Shadow's head, his gesture filled with deep, almost physical affection. "He muffled the smell, girl," he whispered, his hoarse voice barely audible. "He didn't just mask it. He eliminated it. He used something that doesn't belong to the forest to make himself part of it." This confirmed the idea of technological intervention. Yegorov used either special clothing with charcoal filling, or more likely, some kind of chemical agent that neutralized or completely masked the human scent on his shoes and cargo. This was a departure from the purity of the method that Voron valued. He taught blending in with nature. Yegorov taught suppressing it. Analyzing Yegorov's psychology, Voron felt not just anger, but a deep personal insult. Igorov did not hunt to survive. He hunted to prove a point, to prove that his way, the way of the superiority of intellect over instinct, was the right one. He used the morale and the leopard as pieces on a chessboard, and Voron himself as his only worthy opponent. This was the essence of their long-standing conflict. Ivan Andreevich was guided by a code of honor based on the laws of the taiga, where every killing had its price and its meaning. Yegorov, on the other hand, was guided by a thirst, self-affirmation, where the price of murder was measured only by its complexity and how successfully he could deceive Siberia's chief tracker. Voron stood up. He looked around the surrounding forest, no longer as a witness, but as a participant in the game. If Igorov used the psychology of expectation to lure him into a trap, then now that Ivan Andreevich had figured out his trick, Igorov must have sensed his presence. This was not a hunt, but a mutual search, where each step of one was calculated by the other. The Raven knew that his former student was now waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to follow the false, perfect trail that Igorov had deliberately left for him. But Ivan Andreevich did not go. He began to think like Igorov, only one step ahead. If the criminal had so carefully disguised the place where he delivered his trophies, it meant that he could not afford to spend so much effort on the entire route. In the taiga, time and energy are life. Somewhere there had to be a weak spot, where the camouflage was less careful, where Yegorov had compromised between speed and stealth. And this spot had to coincide with his hunting schedule. 3 animals killed in 3 days required regular visits to the cutting site. It was a rhythm that could be calculated. The raven slowly turned, looking not at the ground, but at the treetops, as if seeking an answer from the sky itself. He had to stop reading individual tracks and start reading time and logistics. Igorov, despite all his cunning, was a man subject to physical needs: food, sleep, the need to return to his central point. The murders were carried out according to a specific schedule, which meant that Igorov's next move was predictable. He was preparing for his next outing, and this outing had to be dictated not by instinct, but by cold, technical necessity.
Voron focused all his attention on trying to guess where exactly Igorov would go to reach the swampy area where his perfect trail would fail, where even polymer molds would be unable to withstand the sticky, squelching mud.
This was the only chance where the laws of nature could finally prevail over Igorov's cynical calculation. Voron spent the rest of the night in the gloomy, damp-smelling room of the former gamekeeper's headquarters. He spread out an old, worn map of the reserve on the wooden table, which had become an extension of his memory. Next to it lay Igorov's folder, which no longer contained any secrets, but was merely evidence of his own pedagogical mistake.
Arkady Semyonovich tried to understand his calculations, but looking at Ivan Andreevich, he realized that he was reading not paper, but something much more complex and invisible. Voron did not use a pencil. He only ran his sinewy finger over the map, measuring distances and calculating possible escape routes. The shadow slept at his feet, but its sleep was sensitive, interrupted by a slight tremor, as if the dog also sensed the course of this silent chess game. He killed the first marrow, butchered it, and took the carcass to a temporary storage facility without looking at Semyonovich. Then he returned for the leopard, which he apparently butchered immediately after the first, and he took the third morale yesterday, just 12 hours ago. That's the rhythm. Necessity. He's not collecting. He's stockpiling, and stockpiling requires logistics. The captain cleared his throat nervously. Accustomed to the logic of interrogations and fingerprints, he found it difficult to accept this taiga mathematics based on the speed of decomposition and the psychology of fatigue. Voron explained, "It's impossible to move 3 large carcasses, even if they're cut up, alone, and still cover your tracks to make them look like an animal. The load is heavy, almost 300 kilograms raw weight. Egorov uses something to transport it. A cart, a sled, it doesn't matter. Something light, on wheels or skis, that he can pull himself, and then cover up the tracks with hoof or paw prints." But even the most perfect device cannot override the law of weight. The weight presses down, especially on loose ground. And the longer he pulls, the greater the risk that his thin polymer pads will not hold up, or that the moss will not recover. Consequently, Igorov had to try to get as quickly as possible to a place where he could use more reliable, but less stealthy transport, or where he would not need to mask his tracks. This meant reaching the old logging road, or, more likely, the water. But the path to the water in this part of the reserve was blocked by Bolotisty Crossroads, a vast area of low-lying, sticky swamp that taiga dwellers avoided for miles. Here's his weak spot. Voron's finger pointed confidently at a spot on the map marked with dark green and hatching. Swampy crossroads. It's impossible to create a perfect trail there. The mud is too sticky, too malleable. His pads will sink or shift, leaving his own human footprints. Even if he uses a platform, the tracks of that platform will be visible. He will either have to spend an incredible amount of time camouflaging himself there, or he will have to walk along the very edge, where the chance of failure is highest. Ivan Andreevich figured out his logic. Yegorov, obsessed with superiority, could not allow himself to fail at the final stage of his challenge. He had to choose the shortest but most risky path, hoping that no one would think to look for him there. Moreover, the rhythm of the murder suggested that Igorov needed to retrieve the cargo from the taiga tonight, or, at the latest, tomorrow at dawn. Otherwise, the trophies would begin to deteriorate, and his work would lose its artistic value. "We have to intercept him there," Voron said. His voice, usually low and slow, taking on a steely tone. "You set up an ambush in that area, Arkady Semyonovich. No fewer than 6 people. Spread them out over 200 meters across the swamp. Don't look for tracks. Look for anomalies. Too even a stride. Too strong a smell of neutralizer. Or, most importantly, look for light. He will be moving under cover of night." Semyonovich hesitated, his forehead covered with sweat despite the cool night air. "Ivan Andreevich, if we set up an ambush in the swamp, it's a political risk.
If he doesn't come, we'll be torn apart. And if he comes and uses his cunning against us, we don't know what mechanism he's using. Voron, despising this caution that always separated city dwellers from the taiga, looked up. There was no condescension in his eyes.
He considered Semyonovich and his colleagues to be helpless amateurs outside of the asphalt, and this conversation only confirmed his belief. "He's using your psychology, Captain," Voron cut in. "He's counting on you to act by the book, looking for shell casings and boot prints. He's counting on your cowardice in the face of risk, and your inability to think outside the box.
If you're looking for justice, you have to act not by the rules, but by the laws of the forest. Take your pick. This philosophical ultimatum, thrown in the face of the representative of authority, had an effect. Semyonovich, feeling the full weight of his position and the pressure from above, gave in. He ordered an operational group to be assembled, equipped as fully as possible for work in the taiga, and to advance to Bolotisti Perekrestok. They set out after midnight, under the cover of thick, velvety darkness, in which only the faithful beam of Voron's flashlight pierced the gloom. Ivan Andreevich rode in a separate, more passable off-road vehicle with tin. He did not trust the police in either tactics or their ability to behave in the forest. He knew that their noise, their clumsy movements, and their cynical attitude toward nature could scare Yegorov away from a kilometer away. Yegorov, on the contrary, would move like a shadow, fueled by his obsession. Upon arriving at the edge of the swamp, Voron personally positioned his men. He did not allow them to use radios, ordering them to communicate only in whispers and gestures. He taught them to look not for tracks, but for unnatural balance, what he called the second shadow in his methodology. He explained that Igorov would move so that his shadow and the shadow of his load would blend in with the shadow of the forest as much as possible. They had to search where the darkness was too dense, where the moss was too trampled, but without any traces of sliding. Voron took up his position on an old high hill from where he had a view of a small corridor, which, according to his calculations, Igorov would have to choose to cross the swamp. His body, sinewy and weather-beaten, blended in with the silhouette of an old pine tree. Nearby, pressed against the ground, lay Shadow. Her nose was working, but she showed no signs of picking up a scent. The smell was muffled, just as Raven had expected. The wait was difficult, filled not with fear, but with psychological tension. The feeling that someone was watching you, that your next move was being calculated. Ivan Andreevich knew that Yegorov also saw this place as a trap, and that his coming here was an act of supreme self-confidence. He waited. Hour after hour passed. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the crackling of dry branches somewhere far away. In this silence, Voron felt two of his philosophies battling within him. The old one, based on harmony, and the new one, forced upon him, based on counter-deception. To catch Igorov, he had to become the perfect trap, waiting not for a trace, but for a thought. When the first gray pre-dawn glimmers began to seep through the thick canopy, Arkady Semyonovich, frozen and tense, approached Voron without breaking the silence. He pointed to something in the distance, at the very edge of the swamp. There, in the milky haze, a trail appeared. A single, clear hoofprint of a maral, heading straight for the logging road. Semyonovich whispered barely audibly, "He's here. He's coming right where we calculated." But Voron only narrowed his eyes, his gaze becoming harder. He felt that Igorov had teased them with an obvious lie. This track was not a mistake. It was an invitation. And Ivan Andreevich knew that the real game was just beginning. The gray, sluggish dawn had deceived them. As soon as Arkady Semyonovich whispered about the trail, the police, exhausted from their night vigil on the cold hills, rushed forward as if they had thrown off invisible shackles. Voron saw this from the height of his observation point and knew it was a trap for the eye. The purest manifestation of Igorov's psychology. The Moral's trail, perfectly clear and leading to the logging road, was too obvious. A criminal who had spent 3 days burrowing into the taiga, erasing his own presence to the point of mysticism, could not make such a basic mistake on the home stretch. Ivan Andreevich remained on the hill, not even trying to stop the crowd rushing forward. He felt not contempt for them, but rather a quiet, philosophical pity. They were looking for a simple solution that anyone could find. Igorov knew this, and gave them exactly what they expected to see. The false trail was undoubtedly created with the help of that very polymer overlay, but it was applied with such careless, ostentatious ease that it was tantamount to mockery. Voron waited until the commotion died down, and in the distance, at the edge of the swamp, Semyonovich's disappointed, broken cry rang out. The trail had ended, as if the animal had flown into the air, and nothing was found under the footprint except wet, squelching mud. When the noise of the chase died down, Raven slowly descended from the hill. The shadow followed him, its low silhouette almost dissolving in the pre-dawn mist. He ordered it to stay close, and finally began to read the true trail. He approached the place where Igorov had left the false bait. The Raven did not study the Moral's footprint itself. He studied the logic behind the placement of the track. Even when running, a Moral never places its hoof so evenly and alone, without the slightest hint of displacement or direction. This track was placed perpendicular to the direction of movement, like a point rather than a vector. Ivan Andreevich took 10 steps back and began to move parallel to the false trail. But he did not look at the ground, but at a level 1.5 meters above it. His method taught him that a person carrying a heavy, bulky load, butchered carcasses, would inevitably leave a trace above, not below. He was looking not for perfection, but for unnatural perfection. The criminal focused on camouflaging his feet, but forgot to camouflage his own height and trajectory of movement. A few minutes later, Voron noticed it. At chest level, on a thin branch of a wild cherry tree, there was a microscopic, almost invisible tear in the bark. It was not broken or worn away, but torn, as if it had been caught not by fabric, but by something hard, but fast-moving. The branch was 45 meters above the ground, which was too high for an animal. It was a beacon, small, barely noticeable, which Igorov had probably left completely unconsciously. Catching it with his load during a sharp turn, the Raven continued on its way, guided by these unnatural anomalies, which were located not on the ground but in the air. It looked for broken twigs, unnatural bends in young shoots, and barely noticeable abrasions on the moss above the level of its feet. He understood that Yegorov, carrying a huge load, used this high trail for orientation because it was practically impossible to mask it, and he expected that no one but Voron would think to look for traces above his head. But Igorov did not take into account that Ivan Andreevich Belov knew not only his methods, but also his physiology, his height, his stride, his habit of turning his body when carrying heavy loads. This real, invisible trail did not lead to the logging road, but turned sharply into the marshy lowlands. There, where the mud was the most viscous and where the polymer pads were bound to fail.
It was the most difficult, but also the shortest route to the central ridge. Yegorov chose speed over absolute camouflage. He calculated that while the police were chasing the false Maral, he would have time to slip through the critical section. Voron stepped cautiously onto the swamp. The first steps were difficult. Water immediately filled his old leather boots, but he knew what to do. He looked for the logic of the animal's movement, which Igorov was supposed to imitate but couldn't. The animal walks where it is firm, using bumps and roots. Yegorov had to do the same, but with an unnatural rhythm. He discovered that Yegorov used decking, short, light, pre-cut boards that he placed under himself and the cart, and then took away, replacing them with moss and turf. But even the most perfect camouflage on sticky mud left a phantom trace. When Igorov pulled out the planks, the vacuum, albeit for a fraction of a second, drew the thinnest, almost imperceptible slime from the bottom to that spot. Voron put his hand in the mud, and his fingers felt this unnatural, slippery trace that could not belong to the swamp. It was a technical intervention, revealed by nature itself. Ivan Andreevich slowly, meter by meter, began to move along these invisible beacons and phantom traces. He sensed Yegorov's presence not as a physical imprint, but as a disturbance in the order of space. The deeper he went into the swamp, the stronger this feeling became. It was not just a chase. It was a replay of his own method. Voron felt how his old philosophy, based on harmony, was forced to adapt to Igorov's cynical philosophy, based on deception. To win, he had to become a better liar than his student. He suddenly stopped. The shadow, reacting instantly to his tension, crouched down. Right in front of him, on a relatively solid mound, lay a broken branch. It was not broken in half, but bent and cracked in two places, as if someone had tried to bend it to tie something bulky to it. And most importantly, the branch was 5 centimeters above the level that Voron considered safe for camouflaging a trail. Igorov used this break. He left it as a marker so that he would not lose his way while moving in complete darkness. It was a personal technique that Ivan Andreevich himself had once shown him. Always leave yourself an invisible, illogical beacon that only you can see. Now Voron knew. Yegorov wasn't just leading him down the wrong trail. He was watching his reaction. If he had followed the Maral's tracks, Yegorov would have triumphed. But now that Voron had found his personal, secret beacon, the game had moved to a completely different psychological level. It was a duel where every step was dictated by knowledge of the opponent's psychology. Voron felt the tension building inside him turn into cold, crystal clarity. He could not allow himself any emotions or fatigue. He had to be ahead of Igorov, not only in space, but also in time, anticipating his next move before he made it. He slowly pulled his foot out of the water, the squelching sound too loud in the silence. He took a deep breath of the damp, muddy air. He knew he was walking on the edge of a precipice, and that every step he took now was not just a movement, but a response to his student's challenge. The police, exhausted from chasing the ghost of morale, were useless. Now it was his personal war, his personal atonement for that mistake 10 years ago, when he had failed to eradicate the cynicism in Egorov's soul. Voron moved forward into the very heart of the sticky swamp, where Igorov, confident in his genius,
had left the thinnest, most deadly thread leading to his exposure.
The raven delved deeper into the swamp, where every step was a laborious effort against the sticky, squelching mud.
He followed an invisible trail consisting of Igorov's beacons, microscopic tears in the bark, unnaturally bent branches, and the thinnest layer of slime left at the places where the decking had been removed. The police, confused by the false trail, were far behind, and Ivan Andreevich felt relieved by this solitude. Now he could concentrate fully on the echo of the method. Yegorov's trail was becoming increasingly complex and sophisticated. He led Voron through the most inhospitable areas, through windfall that was impossible to traverse with a heavy load without aids, and through areas of sphagnum moss that could not even support the weight of a cat.
Voron walked, relying not on his eyes, but on his memory. Each of Igorov's steps was a mirror image of a step he himself could have taken 10 years ago. He did not read the trail. He read the thinking.
Voron remembered how he had taught Igorov. In the taiga, your movements must be justified. Every deviation from a straight line, every jump, every tilt of the trunk, everything must have a reason that is understandable to the forest. If you are carrying a load, you must walk like a wounded animal. Illogical, but natural. Yegorov, however, disregarded natural logic. He moved too smoothly, even where the swamp required zigzags. His speed was too constant, and his avoidance of obstacles too geometrically precise. It was in this unnatural symmetry that Voron found the key.
Egorov used his method of camouflage not to imitate an animal, but to imitate the chaos that could hide his technical calculation. He knew that Raven would look for the logic of an animal's movement.
Therefore, Egorov created an animal trail that was logical only from the point of view of human engineering. His path was short, straight, and required incredible strength and endurance to move with a load across such terrain.
Voron realized that each mossy trail was a test for the teacher. Igorov expected Voron to see the perfection of the imitation and recognize his genius. It was the purest thirst for superiority, devoid of any morality.
The duel became a struggle for Ivan Andreevich with himself, with his ideal but cynical version of a student. He had to foresee how he himself would behave if he abandoned the code of honor and chose the path of absolute cold-blooded calculation.
Suddenly, the shadow, which until then had been walking cautiously alongside him, let out a low guttural growl. It stopped, its fur standing on end. The dog couldn't see or smell anything, but it sensed a presence. Raven stopped abruptly.
He realized that they had almost caught up with Igorov, but Igorov couldn't be moving so slowly. That could only mean one thing. They were approaching the central point.
The raven ordered Shadow to sit and, taking out his binoculars, began scanning the dense thickets of cedar and fir trees. He was looking not for shapes, but for anomalies in light and shadow.
Even in the densest thicket, any human intervention, any structure, any tent disrupts the natural pattern of light, casting unnecessary shadows. Within a minute, he found it, a small area of unnatural darkness, perfectly hidden in the thicket of young spruce trees, where the branches had been flattened, not by wind or snow, but by careful human effort. This was Igorov's temporary camp, his headquarters. Gorin realized that Egorov was most likely not inside, but watching this place from afar. He had left this camp as bait, as another element of his game. If Voron had rushed in immediately, Egorov would have known he was coming and left.
Knowing Igorov's psychology, Voron had to act illogically.
He moved slowly and methodically toward the camp, deliberately making more noise than usual. He broke a dry branch, and his hoarse breathing became slightly louder.
He did everything he could to make Igorov, wherever he was, believe that the teacher had taken the bait and was now investigating his base. This theatricality was necessary to make Igorov relax and wait. The camp turned out to be small but incredibly functional. It was a covered area, protected from the rain by a tarpaulin stretched at an angle. This is where Igorov cut up the carcasses.
Everything was clean, drained of blood, and tidied up with fanatical pedantry. Voron noticed the remains of polymer material used to create perfect footprints, and light but very durable straps for carrying cargo.
Here, on the ground, lay the traces of his real shoes. But these were not just footprints.
The soles of the boots were covered with a thin layer of dirt, mixed with an odor-neutralizing powder that Voron could not recognize. Perhaps Igorov had invented it himself.
In the corner of the camp, where Yegorov was obviously resting, Ivan Andreevich found a symbol carved into an old rotten stump. It was not a primitive drawing, but a stylized sign. An inverted raven's beak crossed with a wolf's paw. The sign was clearly carved by him, the raven, with an old hunting knife that Yegorov had once stolen from him and that Ivan Andreevich had not seen for 10 years. The symbol was not just a challenge. It was a personal blow. The inverted raven's beak signified the defeat of the teacher, and the crossed paw signified the victory of cynicism over instinct. Nearby, pinned to a tree with the same knife, hung a neatly folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a note, not candid, but encrypted, filled with hints about their past, about his dismissal from the reserve, about his weakness in front of politicians. Yegorov wrote that Voron had betrayed his own philosophy by yielding to city laws, and that he, Yegorov, was only bringing it to its logical conclusion. If the world can be sold, then the taiga must also be sold. And the one who knows how to sell, the illusion for more, will win.
Voron slowly read these lines, and his face, as if carved from stone, became even more severe. He felt that Yegorov, somewhere nearby, was enjoying this moment, this psychological game.
It was the purest thirst for superiority, not for money, although for that too, but for the affirmation of his philosophy. Igorov collected trophies not as a poacher, but as a collector of rare art, the art of deception.
He wanted Voron, the only person capable of appreciating his genius, to acknowledge that he was right. Voron tore the note from the tree and burned it over a lighter, watching as Igorov's words turned to ash.
This act was his response to the challenge. He did not destroy the camp. He left it untouched, deliberately pretending that he had been deceived, that he had found nothing, and had followed a false trail. He had to make Igorov believe that his trap had worked. Voron, together with Shadow, left the camp, heading not along the trail, but in a straight line, to where, according to his calculations, Yegorov's escape route was.
He knew that the criminal would not stay in the camp for long after such an obvious challenge. He would move on to escape pursuit, confident of his impunity.
Now, knowing that Igorov was watching him, Voron himself became a false beacon, leading his student to apparent victory, but in reality to inevitable defeat. Voron moved away from Igorov's temporary camp, feigning haste and disappointment.
He deliberately made loud noises as he made his way through the bushes, letting the invisible observer know that the trap of the gaze had worked and that the teacher, in despair, had followed the false trail.
Deep down, Ivan Andreevich felt his own nature resisting this deception.
He had always valued honesty and sincerity in the taiga, And now he himself was forced to play the role of a deceived amateur, in order to catch up with the one who had betrayed the very philosophy of the forest.
He knew that Igorov was most likely on high ground, from where he could see the camp and the escape routes. Igorov must now be feeling elated, enjoying how his perfect lie had triumphed over his teacher's truth. It was a pure, unclouded thirst for superiority that drove Igorov more than money. Voron remembered lines from the burned note where Igorov wrote about Voron's betrayal, about his weakness in the face of authority.
Yegorov didn't just kill animals. He proved that cynicism was the highest form of survival. And decency was just a mistake that nature mercilessly corrected.
Voron deliberately behaved as if he had chosen the most obvious, widest path to the river, which he knew was marked on the map as a dead end. This path was supposed to be mined with false tracks and tricks.
But Ivan Andreevich did not look at the ground. He looked at time and energy. Igorov had spent an incredible amount of resources on creating this camp, on camouflage, on polymer overlays. Such obsession with details suggested that for him, trophies, morale, leopard, were not just commodities, they were symbols. Ivan Andreevich slowed his pace when he felt he had left Igorov's presumed observation zone. He stopped at an old cedar tree and leaned against it, closing his eyes. A shadow instantly fell at his feet. Now he could allow himself to be himself. He began to reflect on the essence of the crime. Why didn't Igorov hide the carcasses right away, but left them at the cordon, like a kind of exhibition? Why did he leave such an obvious, albeit false, trail? To attract attention. And, most importantly, to attract Voron. It was a violation of the balance, not only in the taiga, but also in their relationship. Igorov was not looking for a quick profit. He collected rare art, where the highest price was the teacher's assessment.
The marrows and leopards were simply his brushes and canvas, and their deaths were a way to prove that he, Igorov, had surpassed the old, morally outdated laws of the raven. For Igorov, the taiga became not a home, but a laboratory for demonstrating his genius. And that was the most terrible violation of the natural code.
Voron remembered the words he himself had said to Igorov. Technology without respect for nature is simply vandalism. You can deceive a person, but you cannot deceive the forest.
Because the forest senses when you become a sick individual.
Yegorov had become just such a sick individual, poisoning the balance of the system for the sake of self-affirmation.
For Voron, who was guided not by the articles of the criminal code, but by an internal code of honor, such cynicism demanded unconditional removal from the ecosystem. Ivan Andreevich ran his hand over his face, feeling how every wrinkle on his skin, laid down like a riverbed, was imprinted by years of hard, honest life in the forest. He took out his binoculars and, peeking cautiously from behind a cedar tree, began scanning the ridge where, according to his calculations, Egorov should have headed. He was not looking for Egorov, but for his next move. If Yegorov collected trophies like a collector, then he must have a hiding place. A place where he could store and process his prey in complete safety before transporting it to the mainland. The camp he had just inspected was only a temporary cutting point. The hideout had to be more substantial, and, given his desire for absolute camouflage, it had to be a place that was itself part of the landscape, but artificially enhanced with technology. It could be an old, forgotten geological workings, or an abandoned tunnel, or, most likely, a winter hut that Voron himself might have used at one time. Voron scanned the map in his mind.
He knew this part of the taiga better than anyone.
And he remembered one place, an old hunting winter hut, located on a distant ridge at the source of the river, which had been abandoned 30 years ago after a landslide. The place was difficult to reach, had long been excluded from maps and patrol routes, and was perfectly symmetrical to his own path. It would be the ideal place for Igorov, a place known only to the teacher and his closest students.
He whispered quietly to Tenny, and the dog, as if understanding every word, got up. "Over there, girl. Over there, where he thinks he's hiding from both of us." The raven moved with new determination. He knew that Igorov, confident of his victory, might now relax, thinking that his teacher was trapped. It was this self-confidence that was Igorov's biggest mistake, his Achilles heel. Ivan Andreevich stopped imitating noise and began to move as he had taught Igorov. Like a shadow, like a ghost, blending into the background, using the natural sounds of the forest for camouflage. He walked along the edge of the windbreak, his body working like a single well-oiled mechanism that did not waste a single extra calorie on movement. He was the living embodiment of his method, while Igorov was only a cynical, cold copy of it. The further he went, the stronger his confidence grew. Igorov used his genius to deceive nature, but forgot that nature always leaves a trace. In his quest for absolute superiority and perfect camouflage, Igorov failed to take one thing into account: the psychology of survival. Fear, fatigue, and a sense of impunity always cause a person to make mistakes. And now, when Igorov thought he had won, he was most vulnerable. The raven knew that his task was not just to find the winter hut, but to intercept Igorov on his way there. He had to prove that his, the raven's, philosophy, based on respect for the taiga, would always be one step ahead of cynicism and greed. He moved deeper into the forest, his silhouette blending in with the gray hair on his head, his gaze with the eternal, impenetrable darkness of the taiga. He was not going after the poacher. He was going to restore order. Suddenly, Shadow tugged on the leash and let out a quiet, warning growl, directed not forward, but to the left. Raven froze. To the left, across a narrow ravine, ran an old trail that had long been covered with rocks. And right there, at the edge of the ravine, he saw it. A glint. Not metallic, but unnaturally smooth, a short flash of light reflected from something completely foreign to the forest. It was the polymer trail that Igorov had used to hide his cart, but in his haste, he hadn't managed to completely cover it up. Igorov was close, and he had no idea that his teacher, whom he considered defeated, was already hot on his heels. The raven froze as soon as he heard the shadow's quiet, insistent growl, and saw the brief, unnatural glint at the edge of the ravine. That glint, reflecting off something smooth and alien, was louder to him than any scream. It confirmed his key assumption. Yegorov was using something that was not part of the natural taiga to create his perfect tracks and transport his bulky cargo. This was Yegorov's blind spot, the place where his genius for camouflage gave way to technical necessity and overconfidence. Ivan Andreevich, carefully, almost silently, lowered himself to the ground behind a fallen larch trunk, using the old tree as a natural shield and observation point. He took out his binoculars. The light filtering through the thick pine needles was dim but sufficient. He slowly focused his optics on the glint. There, on the narrow stone path leading to the pass, he saw it. A cart. But this was no ordinary taiga contraption, but something high-tech, almost futuristic for these parts. It was a lightweight, single-wheeled cart with a low center of gravity, designed to carry heavy loads in mountainous terrain. Most importantly, the wheel was covered with a smooth polymer rim that, when in contact with the ground, left no clear imprint, but only compacted the soil. It was this rim, poorly covered with moss in a hurry, that gave off that treacherous shine. Attached to the frame of the cart, which was barely visible under the camouflage tarpaulin, were those very polymer pads, stamps that perfectly imitated the prints of predators' paws and moral hooves. Voron felt a cold, almost physical pain from the realization. Yegorov wasn't just cheating. He was cynically using technological advances to mock the purity of their method. He didn't carry the bodies. He rolled them, and then, using the pads, manually created mossy tracks on every convenient section, leading the tracker down the wrong path. This explained why the tracks were sterile and why they lacked the dynamics of a living step. They were static, mechanical imprints. Ivan Andreevich focused on the cart. It had been temporarily left by the ravine, which meant that Igorov was either close by or had just crossed the ravine and was preparing for the next, even more secretive stage. Voron began scanning the area around the ravine, looking for Igorov's own tracks. He knew that the criminal could not have been wearing ordinary shoes. His feet had to be concealed. Ivan Andreevich noticed that while Yegorov was moving on flat ground, he used special shoe covers that were thinner and softer than polymer seals. These covers were made of a complex mixture of rubber and neutralizing powder, the same one that confused the shadow. They did not leave a clear footprint, but only unevenly flattened the moss and pine needles, imitating a random shift in the soil caused by the wind or small animals. It was the perfect invisibility technology. But it was here, on the edge of a steep ravine, that Igorov made a fatal mistake, caused by haste and confidence in his own genius. In order to safely lower the cart down, he had to remove his overshoes to get maximum traction on the rocks. And indeed, Voron noticed a barely visible imprint of a human boot at the bottom of the ravine, where a gentle slope began, left on the wet sand for only a fraction of a second. It was Igorov's footprint. It was a trail that had not been made, but had been set. Yegorov, confident that any tracker would be looking for the mossy trail of a leopard or morale, did not bother to completely camouflage his only real touch on the ground. He figured that no one but Voron would think to look for a footprint where it shouldn't be, in the blind zone between two camouflaged areas. And even if Voron found it, he wouldn't be able to tell that it was Yegorov's, since there were no unique features in the print. But Raven knew Igorov. He knew his habits. The boot print, barely visible in the sand, had a small but distinct shift in the area of the big toe of his right foot. It was the trace of an old injury that Igorov had sustained as a cadet when he broke his toe on a mountain pass. He always shifted his weight slightly to the outer edge of his foot. It was a physiological signature that no polymer or camouflage could hide. Ivan Andreevich felt the tension that had built up inside him dissolve into cold, crystal clarity. He had found more than just a footprint. He had found evidence and a person. Igorov wasn't just deceiving the taiga. He was deceiving himself, believing that he could completely eliminate his human nature. Each of his tricks, each of his technical devices, only emphasized his vulnerability and pride. "He's somewhere nearby, Shadow," Raven whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's unloaded his cargo and is now traveling light to set the last trap or check the winter hut. We need to go further than his mind can reach." Raven knew that Igorov would most likely return for the cart to continue on to the hiding place.
He had to get there before him.
Raven, together with Shadow, began to carefully descend into the ravine. Now he was not following a false trail, but Igorov's true path, which Igorov himself considered invisible. Ivan Andreevich used every rock and every tree trunk to conceal his movements, his sinewy, strong body gliding between the shadows, turning him into the living embodiment of his nickname. He found the place where Igorov had dropped his load. There were traces of straps being tied and untied, remnants of neutralizing powder, which Voron could now identify as a mixture of talc and synthetic fibers used in military camouflage, indicating the military origin of his equipment. Igorov was no ordinary poacher. He was a professional, obsessed with the idea of superiority. Voron picked up a small piece of moss from the ground that Igorov, in his haste, had not managed to put back in place. The moss was foreign to this area. It was sphagnum moss, which only grows in lowlands and swamps. Voron realized that Yegorov was not just camouflaging his tracks using local materials. He had brought moss from boggy crossroads with him to ensure perfect camouflage. It was the last, decisive piece of his puzzle, which tied all the clues together and gave a name to all this madness. It was the secret of the moss. He knew where to go. The raven held a small, damp piece of sphagnum moss in its hand, which Igorov, in his haste or blind pride, had not managed to return to its place by the ravine. This moss did not grow here on the dry, rocky slopes. Egorov had brought it with him, traveling many kilometers to create the perfect illusion. At that moment, Ivan Andreevich saw the whole picture of his criminal plan. It was the secret of moss that gave this whole gruesome game its name. Yegorov wasn't just covering his tracks. He had created a portable, reusable kit for misinformation. The cart, with a polymer rim, allowed him to distribute the weight of the load, avoiding deep human footprints. The stamp overlays, which copied hooves and paws, were only an external tool of deception. But Yegorov's true genius lay in his work with the substrate. He took moss, soil, and even small twigs from the area he was going to imitate. When he placed the overlay, he did not simply press it into the ground. He first laid foreign moss, which was perfectly suited in texture, in place of his step, then placed a polymer stamp on it, and after removing it, carefully restored the top layer, using the moss he had brought with him. It was a way of thinking that truly went beyond the laws of nature. Nature is always changing. Igorov tried to preserve it in order to hide his intervention. He did not rely on chance coincidence. He created coincidence. He used modern, high-tech polymers and synthetic odor neutralizers to imitate the most primitive thing, the trace of a living animal. This cynicism was his main philosophy. Human intelligence, enhanced by technology, can always surpass instincts and the laws of nature, even if that intelligence is directed toward destruction. Ivan Andreevich, clutching the moss tightly in his hand, felt his disappointment in his student turn into something heavier: moral condemnation. Yegorov, in his quest for absolute superiority, had completely lost touch with reality. He had ceased to be a hunter and had become an operator, cynically using the taiga as a backdrop for his crime. He was not seeking the harmony that Voron valued. He was seeking control and the humiliation of his teacher. Voron knew that this moss was not just evidence, It was the key to his next move.
Yegorov, having abandoned the cart and left a false trail behind him, moved lightly toward the winter hut, his hideout.
He was sure that his teacher, like the police, was now chasing a false trail. But Ivan Andreevich, knowing the mechanics of his movement, could now predict his logic. Voron realized that Igorov had most likely not taken the most direct route. He had used a second camouflage technique. Places where his own unmasked tracks would not be noticeable at all, or would resemble a landslide or scree. These places were rocky ledges, scree slopes, and dry riverbeds where the hard surface left no imprint and the stones shifted. It was a new trap, based not on creating the perfect footprint, but on its complete absence. Ivan Andreevich quickly crossed the ravine, moving along the edge of the scree, where every step was a risk. He did not hurry. He listened to the silence of the forest. The shadow walked ahead, its nose raised high, trying to catch any scent, even the faintest, that could penetrate Igorov's neutralizer. But the scent was too far away. The raven had to rely solely on his experience and Igorov's psychology. He remembered another lesson he had taught his student. When carrying a heavy load, always choose the path of least resistance. But when you want to hide, you must choose the path with the most noise. The noise of the forest is your best ally. Igorov was probably moving along the edge of the waterfall, or along a section where the wind constantly blew small stones. This was his blind spot, where, confident in his camouflage, he could move faster, drowning out his noise with the natural background noise. The raven quickly checked the map. The nearest such area was a cascade of waterfalls on the river flowing into the Black Spring. It was the perfect place. The sound of the water drowned out his footsteps, and the wet rocks left no traces. And it was the shortest route to the abandoned winter hut. It was the logistics of a genius intertwined with the cynicism of a criminal. Without wasting a second, Ivan Andreevich changed direction, moving toward the cascade and ignoring the official trails. Each of his steps was now dictated by confidence, by the knowledge that he had uncovered not only Igorov's method, but also his soul. He had found Igorov in his own trap. He was caught between his need for self-affirmation to leave a challenge and his need for safety to leave as quickly as possible. Voron understood that he didn't need a trail on this stretch of the journey. He needed rhythm, the rhythm of a man carrying at least 30 kilograms of equipment, moving quickly and confidently, relying on the noise of the waterfall. Ivan Andreevich himself began to move in this rhythm, feeling his body like a tuning fork, attuning itself to the invisible resonance of Igorov's presence. He reached the cascade. The noise of the water was deafening, and a damp mist hung in the air. The rocks were slippery and wet. No trace, no scent could remain here. Igorov was invisible in his natural environment. But Voron knew that even here, on the rocks, a man carrying a load leaves a trace of tension. He looked closely at the moss growing on the rocks. Even moss, crushed by strong but brief pressure, did not straighten immediately. He looked for microscopic indentations in the moss that quickly disappeared, but for a split second revealed Igorov's path. Ivan Andreevich walked along the edge of the cliff, where a mistake would cost him his life. He found it, barely noticeable, unnatural lines on the moss, spaced at perfect intervals, revealing the rhythmic steps of a person, not the random movements of an animal. It was a trace of intention that Igorov could not hide even under the cover of water and noise. He moved along them as if on a thin, taut string,
his body a concentration of all his years of wisdom and stubbornness.
Coming out from behind the last cascade, Voron found himself on a small, relatively dry plateau, from where he could already see the slope leading to the abandoned winter hut. He stopped. Now he needed to figure out Yegorov's next move. The criminal had probably already reached the hiding place, stashed the cargo, and was preparing for the final stage. Leaving the tiger along the river, where all traces would disappear forever.
Voron knew that he couldn't afford to make a mistake now. He had to catch Igorov not in the hiding place, but at the exit, when he would be reassuring himself of his complete victory.
Voron stood on the dry plateau, breathing in the damp, iodine-filled air, filled with the smell of moss and meltwater. His confidence, gained in the swamp and at the waterfall cascade, was cold and solid, like Siberian stone. Now that the mechanics of the trail had been revealed, polymer seals, a one-wheeled cart, sphagnum moss brought along, he could predict Igorov's logic. He took a step forward, ceasing to chase the past and beginning to look to the future.
Igorov, a man with ambitions but without a true philosophy, could not afford to remain in hiding for long. The winter hut, though reliable, was only a temporary gathering point. The trophies, the leopard skin, the marrow antlers, required urgent transportation and sale. And for this, Yegorov needed access to the mainland, where all traces would finally disappear forever.
And Ivan Andreevich knew that in this part of the reserve there was only one such exit: the river. The river, which originated in these ridges and carried its waters north, was the perfect place to cover his tracks. The fast-flowing cold water washed away any traces and dissolved any smells. Yegorov undoubtedly planned to use a boat, a kayak, or even just a raft to float down the Black Source to the nearest settlement, or to a secret meeting point with buyers. This route by water was his last frontier, his guarantee of complete impunity. Voron unfolded the map and marked the route, from the abandoned winter hut to the nearest convenient place to launch a boat, an old, dilapidated boat dock that once belonged to geologists. The pier was 2 hours' walk from the hiding place. It was there that Egorov was supposed to feel completely safe, believing that his teacher had long since lost his way, chasing ghosts. It was there that Ivan Andreevich was supposed to intercept him. He had to catch Igorov not when he was hiding the cargo, but when he was leaving empty-handed, confident of his victory. It was a psychological victory that Igorov valued more than material gain. He wanted his departure to be a triumph, proof that his cynicism was stronger than morality. "We're going to intercept them, Shadow," Raven said quietly, his voice low and hoarse, like an echo from the tiger. "No traces, no mistakes. We have to be quicker than his thoughts." Raven chose a route that Yegorov himself would never have chosen for transporting cargo. A direct, risky descent down the rocks, through thick cedar undergrowth. This route was shorter, but it required maximum concentration and skill, so as not to leave the slightest trace behind. He used his physical fitness, honed by years of survival, and his knowledge of every rock, every mossy ledge. Ivan Andreevich moved with incredible speed, almost unnatural for his age. He did not run, he glided over the rocks. His shoes, which had seen dozens of kilometers of taiga, found perfect traction even on wet surfaces. Shadow, his faithful Laika, followed him, repeating his every move, her paws not disturbing a single pine cone. It was the art of movement perfected, in contrast to the art of deception used by Igorov. He calculated Igorov's every move. Egorov had probably already reached the winter hut, left his trophies there, and was now preparing for a quick exit. Egorov needed to get rid of his seals and neutralizing powder. Where would he put them? He wouldn't carry them with him all the way to the city. He had to hide them or destroy them on the last, safest part of the journey, probably somewhere near the pier. Voron, several hours ahead of him, came out onto a high, pine-covered shore from where the pier was already visible, a half-rotten wooden platform extending into the dark waters of the Black Source. Silence reigned around him, broken only by the lapping of the water. The pier had not been used for many years, and it was the perfect place for a secret departure. Ivan Andreevich took up a position among the thick juniper bushes from where he could see the entire pier area. He had no intention of waiting for the police. The police, with their instructions and inability to think outside the box, would only be a hindrance here. This was his personal battle, which could only end with the restoration of the natural balance. He carefully examined the pier through his binoculars. There was not a single trace around it. Egorov had undoubtedly already been here and carefully covered everything up, or was just about to arrive. Raven focused on the intermediate section, the place where Egorov must have left his technical equipment to make his journey as easy as possible. He looked for traces of disposal. He noticed that just above the pier, in the thicket of young spruce trees, the branches had been unnaturally moved. It was not the movement of an animal, but human intervention, deliberately concealed and quick. Voron, leaving shadow in place, slowly, like a ghost, moved toward that spot. There, in a hollow between two old boulders, he found a discarded cache. Yegorov had thrown all his tools of deception here. The Raven discovered a crumpled, polymer mold of a morale hoof, scraps of neutralizing powder, and fragments of light but durable camouflage tarpaulin, which he used to cover his cart. Yegorov got rid of everything that could give him away. He was preparing for a clean getaway, leaving behind only an unsolvable mystery. But nearby, in the rocks, Raven found something that Yegorov could not destroy. The imprint of his pride. On a flat rock covered with sand, Yegorov had left a carved pattern. It was not an inscription, but a symbol he had already seen at the winter camp. An inverted raven's beak crossed with a wolf's paw. But next to it, in small letters, was scratched, "Triumph of the Idea." The Raven felt his usually impassive face contort with cold rage. It was the final insult. Egorov hadn't just run away. He was reveling in his imagined victory, confident that the Raven would never reach this place. He believed that the idea of deception and cynicism had triumphed over honesty and respect. Ivan Andreevich knew that Egorov's self-confidence was his only vulnerability. He did not destroy the symbol. He left it as evidence, not of Egorov's triumph, but of his downfall. Voron returned to the shadow and took up his position to wait. He knew that Egorov would have to appear here within an hour to complete his clean departure. He did not contact the police. He had to catch Egorov one-on-one, on his own territory, to prove that the law of survival is always stronger than the law of pride. Ivan Andreevich, blending in with the shadows of the juniper trees, prepared for the most important fight of his life. It was not a battle of strength, but a duel of philosophies. He waited for Egorov to appear on the pier to make him see the true, invisible trail he had left behind. The Raven took up a position among the thick juniper bushes, from where he could see the dilapidated pier and a section of the river. He waited for Egorov, but his waiting was active.
He stopped reading Igorov's tracks. There were none, only the remains of equipment and a trace of pride on the stone. Now he read the taiga. He activated his law of survival. To look not for the criminal's mistakes, but for the behavior of the forest, disturbed by an alien presence. The shadow lying nearby was his second set of eyes and ears. It couldn't pick up a scent trail, but it could sense the forest's alarm. The raven focused his attention on the birds. Usually, at this time of day, swifts fly over the river and predators circle in search of prey. Now it was too quiet.
The birds, which were always on the move, fell silent. Their alarm was not caused by a predator. Predators were part of their world. Their alarm was caused by a stranger who did not follow the laws of the forest. Voron raised his binoculars and slowly scanned the opposite bank of the river. At first glance, everything was perfect. Thick undergrowth, moss-covered boulders. But Ivan Andreevich was looking for something unnatural. He noticed that at the very edge of the water, on a flat, large boulder, lay a branch. The branch was broken, but not by the wind or an animal, but by weight. The branch was thick, about half an inch in diameter, and lay as if it had been placed there on purpose to increase traction, for carrying an extremely heavy load that had to be transported across the water. This branch was Igorov's beacon, but not for camouflage, but for logistics. Raven realized that Igorov wasn't just planning to cross the water. He had already transported part of his cargo, or more importantly, the boat that was supposed to take him away. If he was traveling light, as Raven assumed, he would have left no trace. But if he was transporting something heavy that should not leave a trace on the shore, he needed additional support. Ivan Andreevich looked at the river. The black source was wide and fast here. Swimming across it would be suicide. So somewhere there, on the opposite bank, there had to be a boat or raft that Igorov was going to use. Voron began to look for traces of a hidden presence on the water. He noticed that the water splashing near that very boulder was unnaturally murky at a shallow depth. Not muddy from clay, but muddy from stirring up the bottom, as if something bulky had recently been lifted there. This was the place where Igorov had sunk or submerged his boat, so that it would not be visible from the air or from the shore, and where he had left part of his cargo. Voron scanned the space above his head. Yegorov, knowing that Voron would be looking for clues below, could have left markers at eye level. And he found it. On a branch of an old cedar tree growing on the opposite bank, a thin, almost invisible rope used to secure cargo was neatly tied. It was tied too neatly, too humanly, to be accidental. This rope pointed in the direction of... There, beyond the shore, was a path to an abandoned pier, his true escape route. The whole picture came together. Yegorov first ferried his boat or raft across, sank it near the boulder, then returned for the last part of the cargo in the winter hut. And now, confident that he was invisible, he had to go out to the pier to get down to his boat. The Raven did not move. Yegorov needed to feel safe in order to make his next, final mistake. Ivan Andreevich remained motionless. He felt the tension in the forest growing. The shadow lying nearby trembled slightly, its gaze fixed on the path leading from the winter hut. It was a silent intervention of fate. Nature itself was indicating that the sick individual must be removed. Voron understood. If he missed now, Igorov would disappear forever, and cynicism would triumph over justice.
A few minutes later, Voron noticed movement, not on the pier, but on the path leading from the ridge. It was Sergei Igorov.
He was moving quickly, but not running. His step was confident and self-assured. He had no backpack, only light equipment and probably a weapon. He was lightly dressed, ready to go down to the water. Igorov stepped onto the pier. He didn't look around or glance back. His gaze was fixed on the river, his salvation. His self-confidence was almost palpable. He walked to the edge of the pier, looked at the water, nodded to himself with satisfaction, and began to pull a small but sturdy crowbar from his belt, probably to lift the sunken boat. At that moment, Raven realized he had to catch him now. He couldn't even give him a chance to touch the water.
Ivan Andreevich slowly rose, like a statue carved from stone. His silhouette, weathered by the winds and years of living in the taiga, froze for a moment against the gray sky.
He slowly took out his old hunting knife. He wasn't going to kill, but he was going to restore order. Yegorov! Voron's low, hoarse voice sounded like a clap of thunder in the silence of the forest, instantly cutting through the tense silence.
Sergei Igorov turned sharply. His eyes, which a second ago had been filled with triumph, instantly flashed with shock, mixed with disbelief. He saw his teacher, an old wiry man with his usual scolding tone, standing on a hillock. Igorov, confident in his genius, could not believe that his secret of MKH had been revealed and his triumph of ideas interrupted. It was the collision with the inexplicable. For him, Voron's appearance here, on the very edge of his salvation, was tantamount to the intervention of fate itself. Yegorov quickly reached for his belt, but the Raven was faster. He took a sharp, warning step forward. "Don't, Sergei. There are no escape routes here. You have reached the end of your journey," said Raven. Now that Yegorov had been caught, the final challenge began. A duel not of strength, but of words and philosophy. "Yegorov!" Voron's voice, low and hoarse, like the crack of frozen wood, instantly shattered the illusory silence of the pier, filling it with the purest, wild tension. Sergei Yegorov, standing at the edge of the rotten platform with a crowbar in his hand, froze, his shoulders tensing. The look he gave Voron was a mixture of disbelief, rage, and the most frightening thing of all, wounded pride. He couldn't believe that the teacher he had left behind on a false trail was standing here, on the very edge of his triumph. It was a collision with the inexplicable. For Igorov, Voron's appearance was equivalent to the taiga itself, suddenly finding a voice in flesh. Ivan Andreevich slowly but decisively descended from the hill. The shadow followed close behind him, its low, intermittent growling the only sound besides the lapping of the river. Voron stopped 10 paces away from Igorov. The distance was sufficient to avoid a sudden attack, but also sufficient for a verbal duel, which was more important to Ivan Andreevich than any physical confrontation. He didn't just want to catch the criminal. He wanted to destroy his cynical philosophy. "You're here, teacher." Yegorov finally found his voice. He was young and strong, but his eyes revealed a driven, nervous energy. "I thought you were chasing my leopard somewhere in the swamp. You tricked me. You answered the call."
There was a strange satisfaction in his words.
Voron confirmed that Igorov had managed to create the perfect deception, and that was the highest praise for him. He held the crowbar in his hands not as a weapon, but as a symbol, a tool with which he intended to open the way to his freedom. "You didn't deceive me, Sergei," Raven replied in a low voice.
He spoke slowly, as if each word had weight and should not be wasted. You deceived Tiger. You used the knowledge I gave you to abuse her.
You have become a sick individual who must be removed from the system. Yegorov laughed, but it was a sharp, empty laugh that didn't reach his eyes.
A sick individual? You're talking like you did 10 years ago. You drove me away because I dared to go beyond your primitive morality. You defend the reserve that you yourself betrayed when your influential official fired you. You are afraid of progress, Voron. I simply proved that my idea, the triumph of the idea, is absolute. I created a trail that no one could read, not even you. And I left it there so that you would know that I am better. He waved his hand sharply to the side. Look, teacher, where is your law of survivor? My trophies, the leopard skin, the maral antlers, are waiting to be taken away. They are already hidden in the boats. My trail has been washed away by the water. Your police are searching for me for miles, chasing a mirage. I won because I think technologically, and you think instinctively. I used your own method, but I perfected it. This is my redemption. I proved you wrong when you called me a cynic. The raven took a small, barely noticeable step forward. The shadow tensed. Your redemption? You called it the triumph of the idea on stone, Sergei. But an idea based on pride always leaves a trace that is invisible to the eye, but felt by the heart. You are no better. You just stopped listening to the forest. You started deceiving it, and deception always leaves a mark that cannot be erased by polymer or water. Ivan Andreevich pointed his knife at the river. Your boat is sunk by that boulder. You carried it across using a broken branch for support. You covered your tracks by bringing sphagnum moss from the swamp, but you forgot that your injury forces you to shift your weight to the outer edge of your foot, and you left that mark in the sand by the ravine. You thought I would be reading the leopard's tracks, but I was reading you. I read your survival psychology. You weren't looking for salvation. You were looking for an audience for your triumph. Yegorov's face contorted. It was not rage, but horror, that his absolute perfect lie had been exposed in the smallest, most intimate details. He realized that Voron had not just found him. Voron had gotten inside his head, reading his thoughts and intentions, using not technique, but knowledge of human nature. It was much scarier than any chase. You left a false trail in the swamp to distract the police. Raven continued, his voice becoming like a whisper in the wind, but perfectly audible. You knew they would find it and follow it, because they are looking for a simple explanation. You created a cognitive trap, but you didn't take into account that your own pride would make you return to the winter camp to leave a challenge for me. You couldn't leave without proving that you had won. Yegorov flinched. He raised the crowbar, but his movement was desperate rather than threatening. I didn't lose. I proved that your morality is weakness. You let them fire you because you were too honest. And I will take what I think is necessary, because I am stronger. Strength is not in deception, Sergei. Voron cut him off, his gaze becoming heavy and calm, like that of a bird of prey. Strength is in balance. You have violated it. You have become a tumor on the body of the tiger, and it will punish you itself. Ivan Andreevich took a second, decisive step forward, his old hunting knife glinting in the morning light.
The verbal duel was over. Now it was the turn of the law of survival. The verbal duel was over. The space between Voron and Igorov shrunk, turning into an arena where philosophy gave way to the pure, wild law of survival. Igorov, whose pride had been shattered by Voron's accurate hit on his trauma and triumph, no longer sought words. A desperate fire flared in his eyes, one that Ivan Andreevich had seen hundreds of times in the eyes of people who had reached their limit. He raised a crowbar, a heavy metal tool designed for lifting boats, and his movement was sharp and without warning. Voron did not dodge or respond to force with force. His body, sinewy and strong, was trained not for boxing, but for survival. He knew that Egorov was young and strong, but his movements were straightforward and predictable, just like his criminal logic. Igorov, accustomed to relying on technology and deception, did not understand that in close combat, his strength turned into weakness. When the crowbar whistled through the air, Voron did not take a step back, but made a sharp, unexpected step to the side, toward the edge of the pier. He used Igorov's own momentum and weight against him. The crowbar struck the rotten boards with a deafening sound, knocking out a bunch of splinters. At the same second, Voron used his elbow to strike Igorov, not on the head, but on the lower torso, the center of balance that Igorov had lost due to haste and rage. Igorov staggered. At that moment, Voron gave the command. "Shadow," he exhaled hoarsely. Laika, who until that moment had been restrained by invisible discipline, rushed forward. Shadow did not grab his throat. She did not tear flesh. She was trained to work psychologically. She grabbed Yegorov by the edge of his trousers on his right leg, the one that was injured, and pulled him aside. It was a distraction, calculated to target a pain point and reflex. Egorov, instinctively trying to keep his balance on his weak leg, loosened his grip on the crowbar and tried to brush the dog away. That moment was enough for Voron to act. Ivan Andreevich did not take out his knife. He knew that true punishment should come not from man, but from the taiga, which Igorov had tried to deceive. Voron grabbed Yegorov by the shoulder and pushed him sharply, not forward toward the water, but sideways toward the edge of the pier, which was deliberately the most rotten and slippery spot. Yegorov, whose shoe covers were probably still covered with the remains of neutralizing powder and wet clay, slipped. His balance, disturbed by the dog and Voron's push, finally left him. He collapsed, but he did not fall to the ground, but into the water, into the shallow, viscous space between the pier and the shore, where the bottom was muddy and boggy, like a mini swamp. It was a trap created by nature itself. Egorov, finding himself in the mud, instinctively tried to stand up, but his shoes, designed for stealth on solid ground, now worked against him. His feet began to sink into the sticky, squelching clay. Yegorov panicked. Fear, cold, and humiliation instantly broke his composure. He, who considered himself stronger than the laws of nature, was now caught in its simplest trap. He tried to break free, but the harder he struggled, the deeper he sank into the mud. The raven, standing above him on solid ground, looked at him with a heavy, calm gaze. He felt no malice, only quiet sadness for a man who had betrayed his gift. "Your strength is not in deception, Sergei," the raven said hoarsely, watching Igorov's futile attempts to escape. "Your strength was in respect for what you know. You replaced it with pride, and now your own tools, your powder, your shoes, have become chains." The crowbar that Igorov was holding slipped out of his hands and fell into the water with a dull, silent splash that seemed louder than the sound of the waterfall. Ivan Andreevich knew that Yegorov would not drown, The mud was shallow, but viscous enough to immobilize him for a while, until help arrived. Nature itself punished the one who wanted to deceive it, using his own equipment as a trap. Yegorov, exhausted by physical struggle and psychological shock, stopped struggling. He lay in the muddy water, his eyes full of rage, but already without fire, looking at his teacher. The raven, satisfied that Igorov was immobilized, knelt at the edge of the pier, his sinewy, strong hand touching the wet board. He did not tie Igorov up, nor did he lecture him. He just looked at him. At that moment, a heavy, unbearable silence hung between teacher and student, broken only by the splashing of water and the distant, faint cry of a bird. Ivan Andreevich took out the radio that Arkady Semyonovich had given him and said 2 words: "Trail found." He knew that the police would arrive in an hour, but for him, the matter was closed. Justice had been restored, not by city laws, but by the law of survival. The law that said that any imbalance, any sick individual, would ultimately be removed from the system. He got up, his clothes dry and untouched. He hadn't gotten dirty in the mud. The shadow, having received tacit permission, approached Yegorov and growled briefly and low, confirming its victory over the stranger. The raven knew that the physical trail left by Igorov would be carefully examined by the police, but the true trail, the trail of his pride and defeat, would remain forever in the clay of this pier. Igorov had been caught, and the balance of the taiga, disturbed by the mossy trail, had been restored. He had to wait about an hour. It was a long, meditative time, filled only with the splashing of water and silence, which finally seemed real, not created by deception. Yegorov lay in the sticky, cold mud, his body periodically shivering from the cold and powerless rage. He did not try to speak. The verbal duel was over, and he had lost it even before the physical fight began. Realizing that the teacher had read not only his tracks, but also his soul. Vorin stood over him like a motionless stone statue whose presence was the embodiment of the very law of survival that Igorov had so cynically tried to reject. When a distant but distinct engine noise was heard in the distance, Voron knew that it was Arkady Semyonovich, who had finally escaped the trap of the false trail and had come for confirmation. The noise brought by the city always seemed alien and loud in the silence of the taiga. Ivan Andreevich knelt down at the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed on Egorov. He saw in him not just a criminal, but a loss, a talent that he himself had once cherished, but which had been poisoned by pride and cynicism. "They'll take you away, Sergei," Voron said quietly, his voice low and hoarse, like the rustling of dry grass. "You'll be judged by the city's laws. But you've already paid the price, even before them. You lost because you stopped believing in what you were taught. You thought that technology and deception could be stronger than the truth." Yegorov did not answer. He only raised his head, and his eyes, full of dirt and defeat, met his teacher's calm, heavy gaze for a moment. It was a gaze that did not condemn, but merely stated a fact: the violation of balance and its inevitable consequence. Soon the police arrived at the pier. Semyonovich, seeing Igorov stuck fast in the mud on the shore and the imperturbable Voron standing over him, felt both shock and relief. He did not ask any questions. His respect for Voron, always hidden under a layer of official instructions, was now clear and unconditional. Igorov was pulled out. The operatives, struggling through the wet clay, found the crowbar,
traces of the sunken boat, and, most importantly, trophies in the abandoned winter hut. A snow leopard skin, carefully preserved, and magnificent morale antlers.
Everything was confiscated. It was a denouement, staged according to the laws of the crime genre.
Voron did not participate in the commotion. He stood aside, his eyes, Voron's eyes, watching the scene.
He saw Yegorov being led away, his figure, dirty and broken, disappearing among the spruce trees.
The struggle between man and nature was over. Yegorov left the taiga ecosystem just like his victims, becoming nothing more than a statistic.
Arkady Semyonovich approached Voron, extending his hand. He didn't know what to say.
Ivan Andreevich, you saved us again. How did you find him? In this place?
Voron did not shake his hand. He just shook his head.
I didn't find him, Arkady Semyonovich, he said hoarsely. I found his pride. It was the brightest and easiest trace. He pointed to the stone where Igorov had carved his triumph of the idea. The police recorded the symbol, but did not understand its meaning. For them, it was just a piece of graffiti. But for Voron, it was a verdict. Voron did not wait for money or praise. He never worked for that. His justice was internal and did not need official confirmation. His work was done as soon as the balance was restored. He picked up his old hunting knife, which had served him faithfully, nodded to the shadow, and headed away from the pier, deep into the forest. He walked slowly. The fatigue he had been holding back all this time weighed heavily on him. He felt neither elation nor victory, only quiet sadness. He had failed to save his student from his own cynicism. But he had managed to save Tiger from deception. For him, that was the main thing. He was guided not by the criminal code, but by a code of honor that required the removal of a sick individual who was disrupting the balance. Ivan Andreevich walked out onto a clean hill covered with pine trees. From here, he could see the endless blue distance of the Sayan Mountains. He stopped. A shadow fell at his feet, laying its head on his knee. He ran his hand through its thick fur. The true trace is not the one that remains on the ground, but the one that remains in the soul of the forest and in the memory of man. Egorov thought he had erased all traces, but he left the most important one, the trace of betrayal, which is impossible to disguise. The Raven knew that his life would remain the same. He would continue to avoid the city laws and treat the authorities with poorly concealed contempt. But now, after his duel with Yegorov, his faith in his philosophy had become unshakable. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking to restore order, and he had found it. He had put everything back in its place. He moved on, deeper into the forest, his silhouette, sinewy and strong, dissolving among the trees. The story of the Masi Trail was over. It left behind an aftertaste of conscious truth and a quiet, philosophical sadness about a man who could have become a master, but chose the path of deception. The Raven left, leaving behind an unsolvable mystery for the police, but absolute truth for himself. He was the keeper of balance, and his path, like that of the taiga itself, was endless and beyond the reach of time.